We are diving into a subject that serves as kind of the operating manual for every high-stakes decision you'll ever make.
And yet it feels fundamentally unnatural to most people.
Exactly. We're talking about rationality.
We're moving far beyond the everyday definitions, common sense or just being reasonable. Today, we're dissecting the formal toolkits of rationality.
So these are the rigorous systems, like logic, probability, that kind of thing.
Precisely. The systems of logic, probability, and strategic thinking that provide the one consistent path toward evidence-based thought. We're drawing deeply from the intellectual structures that reveal why our intuition so often fails us.
Our mission for you, the intellectually curious learner, is to transform ambiguity into certainty by arming you with these tools. We're going to unpack everything from the tricky calculus of formal truth tables to the dark, counterintuitive logic of the prisoner's dilemma.
And the goal is that by the end of this deep dive, you won't just know what a rational decision looks like.
You'll understand the underlying grammar that makes it consistent.
It's the difference between speaking a language intuitively and actually understanding the syntax and rules that make that language universally consistent.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Where do we even begin?
We have to start at the absolute foundation of all thought. How we define truth itself through formal logic.
When most people think of logic, they think of arguments, maybe debates.
Sure, but formal logic is much more fundamental. It's the rigid bedrock that prevents ambiguity by providing non-negotiable definitions for how propositions interact.
And a proposition is just a statement that has to be either true or false. Right? No in between.
No in between. If you can't define precisely when a statement is true, you can't build a consistent argument. The way we define these interactions is through what are called truth tables.
Okay, I remember these from a philosophy class. They look like a map, almost.
That's a great way to put it. They are the absolute map for reasoning, telling us exactly what combination of inputs results in a true output.
So let's get into the building blocks. I'm guessing we start with and, or, and not.
The very basics. And the basics of conjunctions are often just taken for granted in daily conversation, but formal logic makes them mathematically rigid. We begin with A and D, or what logicians call conjunction.
The rule for P and Q is famously strict. So if P is one proposition like, it is raining, and Q is another, I have an umbrella, the combined statement, P and Q, is only valid in one single scenario.
Right. It's only true when P is true and Q is true simultaneously.
So it's raining. 80, I have an umbrella.
Yes. And if you look at the truth table for conjunction, you see 3 ways for the statement to be false. P is true and Q is false. It's raining, no umbrella.
Or P is false and Q is true, not raining, but I have an umbrella for some reason.
Or both are false.
Yeah.
It demands perfect dual fulfillment. This clarity is vital because in human conversation, we often imply conditions that aren't stated. Formal logic forces them to be explicit.
Okay, that seems straightforward enough. But OR, or disjunction, is where language starts to get messy, I think.
It really does. In common speech, we often use or exclusively.
Like a waiter saying, you can have the soup or the salad.
Implying you can't have both. But formally, logic relies on the inclusive OR.
So it's a much more generous OR.
Incredibly forgiving. The statement P or Q is true if P is true, or if Q is true, or, and this is the key part.
If both P and Q are true.
Exactly. The only failure condition, the only way the statement can be false, is if P is false and Q is false at the same time.
That's a huge difference from how we talk. It feels like a small detail, but it probably prevents a lot of errors in, say, computer programming or legal documents.
It ensures we don't inadvertently exclude valid possibilities. It's a critical distinction.
And what about the last one? Not T, negation.
That one is as simple as it sounds. It's just inversion. If P holds true, then not P is false. If P is false, not P is true. It provides the mechanism for contradicting any proposition and setting up the foundations for proof.
So why spend so much time on these? They seem almost obvious.
Well, we spend this time on these seemingly simple rules because they highlight the need to avoid ambiguity. If 2 people disagree on whether a statement of P and Q holds, they might just be using different, imprecise conversational definitions of and.
But formal logic gives them that common, non-negotiable standard.
It gives them the consistent framework that is the absolute first step toward true rational thought.
Okay, if and or are the training wheels of logic, then the statement implication, or if P then Q, is where we take the training wheels off.
And most people immediately fall over.
It's profoundly counterintuitive.
This specific relationship, if P then Q, is the structural backbone of all formal proof. And here's the first thing to get straight. It doesn't claim P causes Q?
It doesn't. That's what I always assume.
It simply claims that the situation where P is true and Q is false is impossible. It asserts a consistency, not a causality.
Let's break down the truth table for this, because I think 2 of the 4 cases make perfect sense to everyone.
They do.
Let's use an example. If the buzzer sounds P, the door opens, Q. So if the buzzer sounds and the door opens,
Yeah.
that's true. The implication holds. The statement is true.
Correct. That's the intuitive case.
And if the buzzer sounds but the door stays closed, that's true-false. The implication is broken. This statement is false. So far, so good.
But the real mind-bender comes when the premise P is false. This is the source of endless confusion for students of logic.
So the buzzer doesn't sound.
Right. And according to formal logic, if the premise P is false, the entire statement, if P then Q, is automatically considered true.
Wait. Regardless of what Q does.
Regardless of whether the conclusion Q is true or false.
So if the buzzer doesn't sound and the door happens to open anyway, that's false true. And the whole if P then Q statement is true.
True. And if the buzzer doesn't sound and the door stays closed, false, false, the statement is also true.
That feels completely wrong. If I say, if you are a Martian P, then the sky is blue, Q. Since you're not a Martian, the whole statement is logically true.
Correct.
And if I say, if you are a Martian P, then trees are purple, Q, that's also logically true, even though the conclusion Q is false.
Precisely. We call this a vacuously true statement, or the paradox of material implication.
So why? Why does logic insist on this rule that seems to defy all common sense?
Because the implication only makes a claim about what must happen when P is true. If P never happens, the statement hasn't made any false claims, it hasn't been violated, and therefore it's considered consistent and true.
That flies in the face of our intuition, which is constantly searching for relevance and connection. We instinctively feel that if P then Q must be about some meaningful link between P and Q.
And that search for relevance is exactly what trips us up in complex reasoning. Formal logic forces us to ignore relevance and focus only on consistency.
You mentioned this underpins formal proof. How does that work?
Well, this principle, that a false premise implies anything, is essential for powerful proof techniques like reductio ad absurdum or proof by contradiction.
Could you elaborate on that? How does this weird rule make proofs possible?
Absolutely. Proof by contradiction relies on assuming the opposite of what you want to prove. Let's say you want to prove Q. You start by assuming Q is false.
Okay, so you assume the negative.
Yes. Then you follow a chain of logical implications from that assumption. If that chain leads you to an inescapable contradiction or an absurdity like proving that 1 equals 0, it means your initial assumption that Q was false must have been wrong.
Ah, so Q must be true.
Exactly. But that whole chain of reasoning depends on the if P then Q structure. If the rule where false false equals true didn't exist, the entire architecture of proving mathematical theorems and philosophical consistency would collapse.
So it's a necessary correction to our flawed human intuition.
It's what ensures an argument structure holds, regardless of the subject matter. And that's the real power of this specific, very weird truth table.
Okay, so we transition now from the world of certainty, where things are either true or false, to the messy world of uncertainty and risk.
Right. And here we need a different kind of rational toolkit, one that incorporates probability.
This is where expected value, or EV, steps in.
Yes. EV is the formal method rationality uses to handle choices under risk. It dictates what a rational actor should choose if their goal is to maximize long-run utility.
And that utility could be anything, right? Money, time, well-being.
Any value you can quantify. EV takes all the potential outcomes, multiplies each by its specific probability of happening, and then you just sum those weighted products.
So it's basically a long-run average of what the choice is worth.
That's the perfect description. The formula itself is simple. Expected value is the sum of outcome value multiplied by its probability.
But, as we've seen in countless studies of behavioral economics, humans, we just don't do this, especially when the numbers get big or the stakes feel emotional.
And that failure to calculate EV leads directly to consistent, predictable errors. We fall back on heuristics.
Those cognitive shortcuts.
Right, shortcuts that often prioritize immediate certain gains or emotional satisfaction over maximizing mathematical utility over time.
Let's look at the specific examples provided to demonstrate this, because I think they really clarify how EV ruthlessly cuts through choices that feel complex to our untrained brains.
Okay, we're comparing different high-stakes lottery structures. We begin with the foundation, super cash.
Super Cash is the simple one. It offers a 100% chance of winning $1 million.
So the EV is straightforward. 1.co times $1 million. It's $1 million. This is our certainty reference point.
Okay, now let's bring in a high-risk option, Powerball. This offers a 10% chance of winning $2.5 million and an 89% chance of winning $1 million.
And we can assume the remaining 1% results in a zero gain for the sake of the calculation,
So let's run the numbers. For Powerball, we take 10% of $2.5 million,
which is $250,000,
and we add that to 89% of $1 million.
which is $890,000.
So you sum them up. $250,000 plus $890,000, or $1,140,000.
Correct.
So, okay, let's stop there. You have a choice. Option A, Super Cash, guaranteed $1 million. Option B, Powerball, expected value of $1.14 million. If you're a rational agent maximizing wealth, the choice is clear.
Powerball is mathematically superior. It has a higher long-term expected payout, despite that small risk of getting nothing.
But the human tendency, you see this all the time, is to choose the certainty of Super Cash. You take the sure thing, even though you are, in the long run, forfeiting $140,000 in expected value.
We are what they call risk-averse when it comes to gains. We prefer the sure win over a gamble with a higher EV.
Now let's look at the second comparison set, because this one I think truly highlights how confusing probabilities can become. Megabucks versus Lotto USA.
Okay, so Megabucks offers an 11% chance of $1 million.
And Lotto USA offers a 10% chance of $2.5 million. Now, in a casual conversation, Megabucks might sound a little safer. It's a higher probability, 11% versus 10%.
The percentage is a little higher, yes, but the calculation reveals the true rational choice. Let's do the EV for Megabucks.
That's 0.11 multiplied by $1 million. Easy enough. That's $110,000.
Now for Lotto USA, it's 0.10 multiplied by $2,500,000.
Which is $250,000.
Just not even close.
Wow. Lotto USA has more than double the expected value of Megabucks. This is a powerful demonstration. The human brain tends to focus on that marginal difference in probability, the 11% versus the 10%.
And it blinds us to the monumental difference in the value of the outcome. The $1 million versus the $2.5 million.
This is the core lesson of EV, isn't it? Rationality insists on weighting. You have to discount the larger outcome by its probability.
When people overweight small probabilities of huge payoffs, like actual jackpot lotteries, or conversely, when they overweight certainty, like in the super cash example, they are consistently choosing options below the mathematically rational maximum.
They just fail to do the multiplication and addition.
They fail to do the simple math.
So EV is easiest to grasp when we're talking about money, but rationality demands this kind of quantitative weighing even when the factors are more abstract.
Oh, absolutely. Things like hiring decisions or resource allocation.
Right, the challenge here is the lack of a standardized monetary value. We are given this data set comparing three individuals, Archer, Baker, and Connor, on two factors, aptitude and experience.
Let's lay out the numbers. Archer has an aptitude score of 200 and an experience score of 6.
Baker has 300 aptitude, 4 experience.
And Connor has 400 aptitude, but only 2 experience. This is a classic trade-off scenario.
And if we need to make a rational choice, we can't just add the numbers together. Archer would be 206, Connor 402. That would irrationally suggest Connor is twice as valuable.
Of course not. Rationality dictates that we must first assign explicit weighting to each factor. We have to define an expected value function for what we believe leads to successful performance.
Okay, so let's make one up. Say, for example, we're hiring for a highly technical role where rapid learning is key. So that would make aptitude much more important than experience.
Let's say twice as important.
So the rational EV function becomes EV equals aptitude times 2 plus experience times 1.
Simple enough. Now let's apply that weighting to our candidates.
Okay, first Archer. 200 times 2 is 400, plus 6 times 1 is 6. So Archer gets a score of 406.
Now Baker, 300 times 2 is 600, plus 4 times 1 is 4. Baker is 604.
And finally, Connor. 400 times 2 is 800, plus 2 times 1 is 2. So Connor is 802.
Under that rational weighting scheme where we decided aptitude was twice as valuable, Connor is clearly the best choice.
But, and this is the key, if the need was for immediate steady production with minimal training, we might weight experience higher.
We could say they're equally important, a 1-to-1 weighting. then the comparison would shift completely.
So this shows that even when money isn't on the table, the second step of rationality is quantifying and explicitly weighting your values.
Exactly. Without defining the relative importance of aptitude versus experience, any choice you make is arbitrary, not rational.
Okay, so if expected value handles quantifiable risk, what about judgment under conditions of, like, sensory or environmental noise and ambiguity? This is about spotting the target when the background is messy.
This is where signal detection theory, or SDT, becomes indispensable. Most real-world decisions involve imperfect data.
Like a doctor looking at an X-ray, or a military operator looking at a radar screen, or a jury weighing evidence.
In all those cases, you're making a binary judgment. You're saying, yes, the signal is present, or no, it's just noise.
And SDT formalizes this judgment process using a simple but profound 2-by-2 matrix.
It is. This matrix contrasts two actual states of the world, signal present or noise present, against the two possible decisions you can make, say yes or say no.
And this gives us 4 possible outcomes, 2 good and 2 bad, that define all judgment under uncertainty.
Let's walk through them. First, a hit. The signal is present and you correctly say yes. This is successful detection.
Second, a miss. The signal is present, but you incorrectly say no. This is a failure of detection.
Third, a false alarm. Only noise is present, but you incorrectly say yes. This is an error of commission-crying wolf.
And fourth, a correct rejection. Only noise is present, and you correctly say no. You've successfully ignored the irrelevant information.
The crucial rational insight here is that these error types are often in tension with each other.
Meaning, if you try really hard to avoid one, you increase the other.
Exactly. If you try extremely hard to avoid a misalarm, meaning you lower your threshold for saying yes to every little blip, you will naturally, inevitably increase your rate of false alarms. Rationality requires managing this trade-off.
And how do you manage it? How do you decide where to set that threshold?
The rational location of the decision threshold is determined entirely by the relative costs and benefits of those 4 outcomes. The magnitude of the consequences drives the rational decision.
Let's use the high-stakes examples provided, because this really makes it concrete. Let's start with the military security example. Detecting an incoming enemy bomber, the signal, versus harmless seagulls, the noise.
And the decision is launch intercept, yes, or do nothing, no. Now think about the costs. A miss is catastrophic.
The city is bombed. Game over.
A false alarm is costly. You waste a missile, you escalate political tensions, you might even shoot down a friendly plane by mistake. But a hit means the city is spared.
So, because the cost of a miss is effectively infinite, the destruction of the city rationality demands an extremely low threshold for saying yes.
You are rationally required to tolerate a massive number of false alarms. You have to be willing to launch missiles at hundreds of flocks of seagulls if that is the only way to ensure 0 misses.
Okay, let's turn to the medical example. A similar life-altering calculus. Detecting cancer, the signal, versus a benign cyst, the noise.
And the decision is biopsy treat, yes, or monitor and wait, no. A miss means the patient dies. A cost most people would consider the highest possible.
And a false alarm. That's a painful, expensive, and potentially disfiguring unnecessary surgery or treatment. A hit is, of course, a life saved.
Again, the relative costs dominate the decision. Because a miss is death, the rational medical establishment maintains a very low threshold for saying, yes, further investigation is needed.
And this rationally explains why millions of people undergo follow-up tests, biopsies, procedures for findings that turn out to be benign.
The system prioritizes high sensitivity avoiding misses at the expense of specificity. It rationally tolerates false alarms.
Finally, the judicial example. The jury deciding convict, yes, or acquit, no, based on whether the defendant is truly guilty, the signal, or innocent, the noise.
Here, the costs are societal and moral. A false alarm is convicting an innocent person. Most societies deem that the greatest possible injustice.
And a miss is acquitting a guilty person, which releases a criminal back into the community to potentially harm others. Also a terrible outcome.
But the rational legal standard, like beyond a reasonable doubt, is specifically designed to adjust this SDT threshold.
So by demanding extraordinary certainty, the system is rationally setting the threshold for saying yes, convict, extremely high.
Exactly, which means we consciously, rationally accept a higher risk of misses acquitting the guilty to minimize what we perceive as the greater moral cost of a false alarm convicting the innocent.
So rationality isn't just about maximizing good stuff, it's about minimizing the outcome we decide is the absolute worst based on our quantified values.
That is the core of it. We've established that the threshold shifts based on consequences, but how do we move from this qualitative assessment to a precise mathematical determination?
Right. Rationality has to have a formula for this.
It does. It gives us a formula for the optimal threshold, known as beta beta.
And this is where we see the power of quantifying those subjective values we just discussed. The formula, beta beta, dictates the exact optimal cutoff point for saying yes.
Let's look at the structure of the provided formula. It's a ratio. Text value of a correct rejection, text value of a false alarm, times text value of a hit, text value of a miss, text value of a miss.
Okay, let's unpack that numerator first. It's the top part of the fraction. It deals with the benefit of saying no.
Right. You have the value of a correct rejection minus the cost of a false alarm, and you multiply all that by the prevalence of noise, or the probability of noise.
So if the value of a correct rejection is very high, like if ignoring the noise is really beneficial, or if the cost of a false alarm is low, that numerator gets big.
A large numerator pushes beta upward. A higher beta Ds means the decision threshold shifts toward no. It means you require much stronger evidence before you're willing to say yes.
Okay, that makes sense. Now for the denominator, the bottom part, this deals with the value of saying yes.
It's the value of a hit minus the cost of a miss, multiplied by the prevalence or probability of the signal.
This is where that military medical example really comes in. If the cost of a miss is massive, say the city being bombed.
Then that value of a hit minus value of a miss term explodes.
Wait, let me work this through. Let's use numbers. If the value of a miss is a highly negative number, say -1,000 for death, and the value of a hit is +100 for a life saved, then it's 100 minus -1,000.
Which becomes 100 plus the 1,000, so plus 1,100, a huge positive number.
So a high cost of a miss actually makes the denominator very large. And when the denominator of a fraction is large, the overall value of the fraction gets small.
Exactly. When the denominator grows large, beta becomes a very small number, maybe even approaching zero.
And a very small beta dollar means the threshold for saying yes drops dramatically.
You become rationally obligated to say yes much more often, even on flimsy evidence.
This confirms the medical intuition. The massive cost of missing cancer drives the rational threshold way down toward extreme sensitivity, compelling doctors to take action that minimize the miss rate, even if it means way more false alarms.
The beta formula forces us to confront the fact that rationality is not a feeling. It is a calculation where your subjective values must be quantified and balanced against the objective prevalence of the phenomenon in the world.
So if you haven't assigned a value to saving a life versus the cost of an unnecessary procedure, your judgment is just. It's emotional. It's not rational.
That's the hard truth of it.
Okay, so we have dealt with choices determined by objective reality logic, probability, noisy signals. Now we face the true intellectual frontier, strategic rationality.
Yes. This is game theory, where your best outcome depends entirely on the calculated rational choices of other agents.
This moves us from single-player probability problems to multiplayer strategic dilemmas.
And the rational calculation is now recursive. I have to figure out what you think I will do, which depends on what I think you think I will do, and so on, into infinity.
The simplest strategic interaction is the zero-sum game. The name says it all. The total utility in the system is constant.
If I gain 10 units, you must lose 10 units. It's a fixed pie.
We can model this with a simple game like rock, paper, scissors. The provided 3x3 matrix shows this perfectly. If player A wins, they get +1. Player B loses, they get -1.
If they tie, the score is 0-0. The total value is always 0. It's pure conflict.
So in a zero-sum environment, there's no scope for cooperation. The goal is purely competitive self-interest.
Right, and the rational strategy here is to adopt what's called a mixed strategy, to randomly change your choices so that your opponent cannot exploit a predictable pattern.
If you always threw rock, a rational opponent would always throw paper and just clean up.
Of course. This type of conflict is the easiest to analyze rationally because the interests are perfectly opposed. However, most real-world strategic situations, even conflicts, are mixed motive.
What do you mean by mixed motive?
It means they require balancing self-interest with the need for collective utility. The outcomes are non-zero sum. It's possible for both players to benefit or for both to suffer.
Let's examine the coordination game of Dan and Caitlin deciding between Pete's and Starbucks.
Both want to be together. That's the cooperation part. But Dan slightly prefers Pete's, where he gets 100 points of happiness, and Caitlin slightly prefers Starbucks, where she gets 100 points. That's the competition part.
And the payoff matrix clearly shows the two non-coordination failures result in terrible outcomes like 0, 95, or 95, 0. They're both much better off if they just coordinate.
There are two stable points here, what are called Nash equilibria, Pete's, where
Yeah.
Dan gets 100 and Caitlin gets 95, and Starbucks, where Dan gets 95 and Caitlin gets 100.
And a Nash equilibrium is a point where neither person has an incentive to unilaterally move away from that point once they're there.
That's right. The key rational insight is that the choice requires communication and commitment. If Dan decides to move to the slightly suboptimal Starbucks, just to ensure they meet,
He sacrifices 5 units of his own utility.
the outcome, 95, 100, is still vastly superior to the outcome of failing to meet at all. Rationality here demands maximizing collective utility first, even if it means accepting a slightly less optimal individual reward.
Okay, now let's crank up the stakes. The game of chicken. Buzz and James driving cars toward each other. Their choices are swerve or go straight.
The payoff matrix is designed around one single catastrophic outcome, the crash, which yields might of 100 for both of them.
Winning, being the one who goes straight while the other swerves, gets you +1, and being the chicken who swerves gets you -1.
The overwhelming negative value of the crash, that -100, 100, dominates the entire rational calculation.
The rational decision should be to swerve to minimize that massive downside risk.
It should be. However, the game becomes strategically complex because if you can credibly commit to not swerving,
Like you publicly rip out your steering wheel and throw it out the window.
exactly, then you force the other rational player to swerve, thus guaranteeing your small win.
This models high-stakes brinkmanship, like in geopolitics.
It does. Rational defiance, or even the perception of irrational commitment, is often used to secure a slight individual win, the +1, despite risking mutual disaster. It shows how strategic rationality can lead agents to take actions that seem collectively suicidal.
And that brings us to what might be the most famous game of all.
The prisoner's dilemma. Perhaps the most critical framework in game theory for explaining why individual rationality so often leads to collective tragedy. It's the ultimate failure of strategic interaction.
Let's revisit the classic setup of Brutus and Lefty. They're criminal partners who've been caught. They can either cooperate with each other and stay mum, or defect and rat on the other.
And the payoffs are in years of prison time, so lower numbers are better.
Okay, let's walk through it. If they both cooperate, both stay mum.
They both get 6 months. This is the reward for cooperation, and it's the best collective outcome.
But what if I defect while my partner cooperates?
That's the temptation payoff. You, the defector, go free 0 years. Your partner who stayed loyal gets the sucker's payoff, 10 years.
Ouch. Okay, and what if we both defect? We both rat on each other.
That's the punishment for mutual defection. You both get 6 years in prison. Much worse for both of you than if you had just cooperated.
Okay, now let's assume Brutus is perfectly rational. He thinks it through. First, he considers what happens if Lefty chooses to cooperate.
If Lefty cooperates, Brutus can also cooperate and get 6 months. Or he can defect and go free.
Going free is better than 6 months. So in that case, he should defect.
Now, Brutus considers what happens if Lefty chooses to defect.
Okay, if Lefty rats on me, I could cooperate and get the sucker's payoff of 10 years. Or I can also defect, and we both get 6 years.
And 6 years is better than 10 years.
So in that case, I should also defect. Wait a minute. In every single possible scenario, defecting gives me a better result than cooperating.
It does. Defecting is the dominant strategy. And since Lefty is equally rational, he runs the exact same calculation.
And he also chooses to defect.
The iron law of the prisoner's dilemma is this. 2 perfectly rational, self-interested actors will inevitably choose their dominant strategy, which is to defect.
And they both land in the suboptimal outcome of 6 years each, even though they both know that mutual cooperation, just 6 months, was possible and better for both of them.
Individual rationality leads to collective failure.
And this mechanism scales up immediately to huge societal issues. We can apply this PD structure to the tragedy of the commons.
Let's use the conservament matrix from the materials. It models global dilemmas like climate action perfectly.
So here, the choices for our country are to conserve resources, which has a local cost, or emit pollution, which has a local benefit.
And the key structural component is the massive collective cost imposed by climate change, which is set at a -100 for all actors involved, no matter what they do.
So let's analyze the payoffs. If everyone mutually conserves,
Everyone suffers the small local cost of conservation, let's say -10 each. So the total cost is -20, but the climate is saved.
But what if I'm a rational, selfish country and everyone else is conserving?
Then you can emit. You get the local benefits, say plus 10, but everyone, including you, suffers the global climate cost of a negative 100. Still, for you, it's better than conserving.
And if everyone else is emitting?
Well, then you certainly shouldn't conserve and take a negative cost, because you're going to get hit with the negative 100 climate cost anyway. You might as well take the local benefit of plus 10 from emitting.
It's the exact same logic as the prisoner's dilemma. Emitting is the dominant strategy.
It is. The dominant rational choice for the individual actor, the person, the company, the nation, leads directly to the worst collective outcome, the eventual environmental catastrophe.
This framework is profoundly pessimistic about solving large-scale problems purely through goodwill.
It demonstrates that strategic rationality explains societal deadlocks because the payoff matrix is structured to reward selfish, short-term behavior.
So how do you solve it?
You have to transform the game. You introduce external monitoring, legal penalties for defecting, or you set up repeated interactions that allow for trust and reputation to be built over time. You have to change the payoffs.
Okay, we have completed the tour of the rational toolkit, from the rigid consistency of logic through the quantification of risk with EV and SDT to the complexities of strategic interaction in game theory.
These structures are robust, they're formally teachable, and they're universally applicable.
Which brings us back to the central mystery we started with. Why, if the tools for consistent optimal decision-making are available, does rationality appear so scarce in everyday life and public debate?
I think the first reason rationality is scarce is that people often fail to use the basic logical frameworks required to interpret complex data correctly. They fall prey to superficial observation.
Let's use the provided public data example, the one concerning gun control and crime rates. We're given a 2x2 table showing outcomes in areas with gun control versus areas with no gun control.
Right, and let me just say, we are not taking a stance on the policy here. We are purely looking at this as a problem of rational statistical interpretation.
Absolutely. So the raw counts in the table show that in places with gun control, crime decreased in 223 instances. In places with no gun control, it decreased in 107 instances.
And for crime increases, 75 instances with gun control and 21 instances with no gun control.
So the intuitive heuristic-based interpretation, the quick, non-rational take, is to focus on the biggest number.
Look, gun control must work. It has 223 crime decreases, more than double the 107 decreases in the no control group.
That's the headline you'd read. But rationality demands we compare the relative rates. We have to compare the successful outcomes to the failed outcomes within each policy group.
Let's do that. For the gun control group, the decrease to increase ratio is 223 divided by 75.
Okay, 223 divided by 75 is roughly 2.97. So a ratio of approximately 2.97 to 1. Almost 3 successes for every 1 failure.
Now for the no gun control group, the decrease to increase ratio is 107 divided by 21.
107 divided by 21, that's about 5.09. So a ratio of approximately 5.1 to 1.
Wait!
Yeah, that's astonishing. The raw numbers made it look like gun control was twice as effective at generating decreases. But the rational comparison of the rate of success shows that the areas with no gun control actually had a greater likelihood of 5.1 successes for every 1 failure than the areas with gun control, which only had 2.97 successes for every 1 failure.
This is a powerful illustration of the logical error called neglecting the base rate, or neglecting the comparison control. Without applying the formal framework of ratios, the initial observation of raw counts is not only insufficient, it is actively misleading.
Rationality forces us to ask the right comparative question.
It does.
It becomes undeniable, then, that these frameworks are not just intellectual toys. They're the necessary scaffolding for robust, optimized societal governance.
Think about the sweep of the concepts we covered and how they apply globally. Expected value forces governments to quantify the long-term risk and return of massive infrastructural investments.
So they don't just chase symbolic, high-risk projects that have a low EV.
Signal detection theory guides regulators in setting safety standards for pharmaceuticals. They have to decide the rational threshold for allowing a drug onto the market, balancing the risks.
Tolerating a slight risk of a false alarm, like a minor side effect, to minimize the catastrophic miss of not approving a life-saving drug.
And game theory informs international diplomacy. Recognizing the prisoner's dilemma dynamics in arms races or climate treaties is the first rational step toward designing systems that change the payoff matrix to favor cooperation.
These tools move collective decision-making out of the realm of, political posturing and into the domain of calculation, consistency, and optimized outcomes.
They allow societies to measure the true costs of their errors.
So, back to the big question. Why the perpetual scarcity of this kind of thinking?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, the complexity of the rules is a huge clue. Mastering the nuance of the implication truth table, or consistently calculating the optimal beta threshold, or overriding the dominant strategy in the prisoner's dilemma, these tasks are mentally taxing.
It requires that slow, deliberate, what Daniel Kahneman calls System 2 thinking, overriding our cognitive default.
Exactly. Our brains have evolved these powerful, fast, heuristic-based thinking systems. System 1. Heuristics are mental shortcuts, rules of thumb. They're great for survival when speed is critical.
But when you're faced with the complexity of modern financial markets or global climate negotiations or statistical interpretation,
Those quick shortcuts become consistent, predictable errors.
for example, the availability heuristic,
Mhm.
that's the one that makes us overweight risks that are easy to remember, like plane crashes, even though they're statistically incredibly rare.
And the framework of EV tells us to ignore that emotional intuition and rely only on the objective probability.
So rationality is therefore a constant act of intellectual labor.
It requires effortful application of rules that correct our innate defaults. The scarcity of rationality isn't due to fundamental human stupidity. It's due to the consistent human preference for the quick, easy answer supplied by intuition over the slow, difficult, but ultimately accurate answer supplied by formal methods.
So rationality, then, is a skill set. It's a toolkit we have to consciously choose to deploy to ensure we are being consistently right, rather than just intuitively wrong. That's a powerful thought to end on.
It truly shows that structured thought is the key to unlocking better decisions, both for ourselves and collectively.
So now that you know the formal definition rational choice, how it handles logic, uncertainty, and strategic interaction, how will you consciously approach the next high-stakes dilemma you face? Will you default to the quick heuristic, or will you take the time to calculate the expected value, adjust the signal detection threshold, or identify the dominant strategy trap? The intellectual labor starts now.
For a concise visual walkthrough of these ideas, see the mini explainer video linked in the description for Rationality.